Welcome to Mindful Moments. Nourish your mind on the go. This audio uses AI narration to present our original book analysis. Today, we're diving deep into War and Shadows by Mai Lan Gustafsson. It's not your typical war story. It explores the haunting aftermath of the Vietnam War. But through this really interesting lens of spirit possession, we'll be using excerpts from the book itself, giving us a first-hand look at how people grapple with the unseen consequences of conflict. So get ready to uncover some surprising insights into Vietnamese culture, beliefs about the afterlife, and the enduring impact of war.
Yeah, it's fascinating how Gustafsson unveils this unseen war, this war that continues to rage in the minds and spirits of those touched by the conflict.
Right, it's like she's peeling back these layers of history and trauma to reveal a world where the line between the living and the dead is blurred.
Exactly. And central to this unseen war are the angry ghosts, the spirits of those who died violently, often far from home. And without proper rituals, they're believed to linger, causing illness and misfortune in the living.
And the book opens with this woman named Mrs. Vid. She's a successful businesswoman. And on the surface, she seems to embody post-war Vietnam, thriving, modern. But beneath that facade, she's secretly suffering from self-mutilation. And she believes it's her dead brother, a casualty of the war, who's behind it all.
Yeah, Miss Vid's story is a stark reminder that the past isn't always past. It can linger in ways we don't expect, manifesting in both physical and psychological distress.
To understand this, I think we need to delve into traditional Vietnamese beliefs about the afterlife.
Okay, so in Vietnamese culture, there's a clear distinction between Tien and Con Ma. Tien are ancestral spirits who are revered and honored, while Con Ma are these restless, angry ghosts unable to find peace.
So it's the circumstances of their deaths that determine their fate in the afterlife.
Precisely. Those who die violently, far from home, or without proper rites become Con Ma, seeking to disrupt the lives of the living. And in a war as brutal and widespread as the Vietnam War, with so many dying far from home, the sheer number of these Con Ma becomes almost unimaginable.
It really adds a whole new dimension to the devastation of war.
Absolutely. And this belief system clashed with the communist government's efforts to suppress superstition after the war. It created this tension between deeply held beliefs and official ideology.
Yeah, it's almost like an underground spiritual resistance movement.
Exactly. Mediums and spirit practitioners, forced to operate in secrecy, become these guardians of a belief system that refuses to be extinguished.
And Gustafsson really brings this to life through a series of compelling case studies, each one a window into the diverse ways spirit possession manifested.
Each case reveals this fascinating connection between the symptoms of the afflicted and the circumstances of the ghost's death. It's not random. There's a logic to it rooted in these cultural beliefs.
Like Professor Phu haunted by his brother, or the heroic mother tormented by her children lost in the war. There's even an American haunted by a Viet Cong soldier. Each story is a piece of this larger puzzle.
And these aren't just ghost stories. They offer profound insights into the psychological and social landscape of post-war Vietnam, showing how deeply intertwined the spirit world is with everyday life.
But perhaps the most intriguing aspect is the connection Gustafsson draws between the resurgence of spirit possession and Vietnam's economic reforms, Doi Moi, in the 1990s.
Right. That's where the story takes a truly unexpected turn. Doi Moi was intended to usher in an era of prosperity. But some believe it also inadvertently empowered the Con Ma, the economic boom, while positive in many ways, may have disrupted the balance between the material and spiritual, giving these restless spirits a foothold.
Almost as if they were lying in wait, waiting for the moment to reassert themselves.
That's a powerful image, and it raises important questions about the unintended consequences of societal change, especially rapid change, on deeply held cultural beliefs.
So if people believed they were suffering from spirit possession, what did they do? How did they seek help?
Well, Gustafsson explores the role of mediums and traditional healing practices, describing a lendong ceremony, where a medium channels the spirit world to provide answers and guidance.
Well, I'm trying to imagine what that must feel like. The fear, the desperation, but also the glimmer of hope for answers and relief. It must have been an incredibly intense experience.
Absolutely. These ceremonies offered a space for individuals to confront their traumas and seek a path towards healing, but all within the framework of their beliefs and traditions. And what's even more thought-provoking is that the idea of angry ghosts isn't unique to Vietnam.
You mean this could be a universal human response to the trauma of war?
That's the question Gustafsson leaves us with. Are these beliefs specific to Vietnamese culture? Or do they reflect a broader human need to grapple with loss and suffering through the lens of the supernatural?
It definitely makes you wonder. There's so much more to unpack here. This is just the beginning of our deep dive.
And it's crucial to remember that the Vietnam War wasn't just a war between nations, but a deeply divisive civil war. This internal conflict adds another layer of complexity to the concept of angry ghosts.
So how does that internal division factor into this? Would these angry ghosts target only those on the opposing side? Or could they also haunt those they once considered comrades?
Well, that's a question Gustafsson grapples with throughout the book. The North Vietnamese, as the victors, had to reconcile with the fact that many of their enemies were their own countrymen from the South. It blurred the lines between us and them, creating a moral and spiritual dilemma when it came to interpreting spirit possession.
It makes you think about the potential for these kanma to become symbols of unresolved guilt, or even a subconscious desire for reconciliation.
Exactly. And this internal struggle is further complicated by the communist government's official stance on these beliefs. They dismiss them as mere superstition, remnants of a feudal past they were trying to move away from.
But as we've seen, those beliefs persisted. They even thrived, despite the government's efforts to suppress them.
This created a double bind for those suffering from spirit possession. They couldn't openly seek help through traditional means without risking repercussions from the authorities. Imagine the internal conflict, torn between your deeply held beliefs and the fear of political consequences.
It must have been incredibly isolating to feel like you couldn't openly acknowledge your suffering.
Absolutely. It speaks to the deep-seated nature of these beliefs that they continued to flourish, even in a climate of fear and repression.
But it seems like things began to shift with the introduction of doi moi in the 1980s, Vietnam's economic reforms. Did this have a positive or negative impact on this spiritual landscape?
It's not so straightforward. Doi moi was a period of immense change, a double-edged sword in many ways. While it ushered in an era of economic liberalization and improved living standards for many, it also led to a resurgence of these spiritual beliefs and practices, some of which had been suppressed for decades.
It seems counterintuitive that economic prosperity would lead to a resurgence of beliefs in angry ghosts.
Think of it this way. Doi moi opened up Vietnam to outside influences and loosened restrictions on traditional practices. It was a loosening of control, both economically and culturally. Perhaps this created a space for those long-suppressed beliefs to resurface, like a spring finally released.
So it wasn't just about economic changes, but also about a cultural shift, a reclaiming of traditions that had been pushed aside.
Precisely. For some, it was a way to reassert their cultural identity in the face of rapid modernization. For others, it might have been about finding solace and meaning in a time of great upheaval and uncertainty. Doi moi brought about a complex mix of emotions and reactions.
And Gustafsson doesn't shy away from exploring these diverse reactions through the personal stories of those she interviewed.
One of the most powerful stories is that of Mrs. Liu. Haunted by the ghost of her son who died in the war, she's experiencing physical pain and emotional distress, and she turns to a medium named Phuong for help.
What happens during the session?
It's incredibly dramatic. Phuong goes into a trance, channeling the spirit of Mrs. Liu's son. Through the medium, the son reveals the details of his death, his suffering, his anger at being abandoned. It's a harrowing confrontation, both terrifying and cathartic.
So it highlights the belief that these angry ghosts need to be acknowledged, understood, even appeased, to find peace and stop tormenting the living.
It's not just about fear, it's about resolution, finding a way to heal those wounds that transcend the boundaries of life and death.
But not everyone sought help through mediums. Gustafsson also mentions other coping mechanisms for spirit possession.
Right. Some relied on traditional forms of healing, like herbal remedies or prayer. Others tried to appease the spirits through offerings and rituals. It's fascinating to see this spectrum of responses, reflecting individual beliefs and circumstances.
It seems like there was no single right way to deal with this phenomenon. It was a deeply personal journey for each individual.
And these individual experiences weren't happening in a vacuum. They reflect broader anxieties about the war, the loss of life, and the immense task of rebuilding a nation after such a traumatic event.
So it wasn't just personal suffering, but a collective experience that shaped the way an entire generation viewed their world.
Absolutely. And this collective experience was further complicated by the political and ideological context of post-war Vietnam. The communist government's stance on these beliefs created a complex dynamic.
On one hand, they dismissed them as superstition. On the other, they sometimes exploited these beliefs for their own purposes. Can you give an example of this?
One example is how they used the concept of liet sai, revolutionary martyrs who died in the war. They were elevated to heroic status, almost like secular saints. Despite the government's official stance of atheism, it was a way to control the narrative, to channel these beliefs towards their own political ends.
It sounds like there was a lot of ambiguity and contradiction in the way the government dealt with these beliefs.
Absolutely. It reflects the inherent challenges of navigating a society in transition, where traditional beliefs and modern ideologies inevitably clash. And as Gustafsson demonstrates, this clash wasn't just about abstract ideas, it had real-world consequences for how people, especially those suffering from spirit possession, understood their own experiences.
It's a reminder that you can't simply erase centuries of belief and tradition with a new political ideology.
Exactly. These beliefs, especially when intertwined with trauma and loss, run much deeper than any political agenda.
And as you've mentioned, it's through the personal stories that we truly grasp the complexity and nuance of this phenomenon. It's not just about ghosts and spirits, but about the anxieties, traumas, and hopes of a nation struggling to come to terms with its past.
It's a powerful reminder that the wounds of war extend far beyond the battlefield, shaping lives and beliefs for generations to come.
It strikes me that this book goes beyond just the supernatural. It's a profound exploration of Vietnamese culture and the enduring impact of war on the human psyche.
Yeah, Gustafsson brilliantly connects these beliefs about angry ghosts to broader themes of social change and cultural identity. It's not just about static beliefs, but about how they're constantly being negotiated and reinterpreted as society undergoes transformation.
Like when she talks about filial piety, with such a cornerstone of Vietnamese culture.
Yeah.
And it really factors into how people relate to these angry ghosts.
Right. Imagine that internal conflict, fear, and potential harm from these spirits, yet this deeply ingrained sense of duty and obligation toward them, especially if they're family members. It's a fascinating paradox.
Fear and reverence intertwined. It speaks to the complexities of navigating tradition and modernity in a society that's experienced such profound upheaval. And, we've talked about how Gustafsson doesn't shy away from the political dimensions of these beliefs either.
No, not at all. The book delves into how the communist government's attempts to control and manipulate these beliefs ultimately backfired. They couldn't erase something so deeply rooted in the cultural fabric of the nation.
Right. Their attempts to suppress these beliefs might have even inadvertently strengthened them, driving them underground, making them even more potent.
It's a classic example of the Streisand effect. You can't legislate away deeply held beliefs, especially when they're tied to such profound experiences of loss and trauma. It speaks to the resilience of culture, its ability to adapt and persist even in the face of political pressure.
Okay, so what does this all mean for us, the listeners? Why should we care about these beliefs in Vietnam?
Well, firstly, it challenges us to broaden our understanding of war and its consequences. It's not just about the physical destruction and political upheaval, but about the deep psychological and spiritual wounds that can linger long after the battles have ended. War in Shadows reminds us that the impact of war extends far beyond the battlefield, shaping individuals and societies for generations to come.
Yeah, it's a powerful reminder that the human cost of war is multifaceted and can manifest in unexpected ways.
And secondly, it encourages us to think critically about the relationship between culture and power. How do governments and institutions try to control or manipulate beliefs and practices? How do individuals and communities resist or subvert those attempts? These themes are relevant not just in Vietnam, but in any context where there's tension between dominant ideologies and deeply held beliefs.
It really makes you question assumptions about the boundaries of belief.
Yeah.
And the ways in which power dynamics influence cultural expression.
Right. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, it invites us to consider the role of the supernatural in our own lives and cultures. Do we have similar beliefs about ghosts and spirits? How do we explain and cope with experiences that defy rational explanation? Gustafsson's book, while rooted in the specific context of Vietnam, raises universal questions about how humans grapple with the mysteries of life and the unseen world.
Yeah, it compels us to confront our own assumptions and be open to different ways of seeing and understanding the world, acknowledging that there may be forces at play that we don't fully comprehend. Well, War in Shadows has been a truly eye-opening deep dive, and I highly recommend it to anyone who wants to explore the hidden dimensions of the Vietnam War and the complexities of Vietnamese culture.
Yeah, it's a book that stays with you long after you finish reading it, prompting you to question, reflect, and perhaps even re-examine your own beliefs about the world.
You can find a link to purchase War in Shadows in the show notes. Don't forget to subscribe to Mindful Moments for more enriching deep dives into compelling topics. We'll see you next time.